pay your sister back?
No. I've paid her back in other ways. No. Uh-huh.
What happened to the Mama Cisa's second baby?
So the second baby lived and the first baby died. I got a lot of donations from that story, so ended up Western Unioning all the donations to the sister who ended up being the guardian. And when I called her, I think it was about 6 months later that I was sending her the donations, and she said the first baby had died and the second one lived. Mm-hmm.
What's next? What's the story that you would like to cover?
I'm working on a long-term story right now. I can't really talk about it, but it's in Belgium, of all places. And I've been working on it for about 8 months. And then I just finished a story in America for National Geographic. And I'm about to start another story in the U.S. For Time, long-term. So I'm doing 3 long-term stories.
How's covering America versus?
It's fascinating. I think it's a really interesting time to work here. Actually, I'm much more interested in working here at home than I am right now working overseas, because I think it's a really interesting time to be American, and a lot of the stories that I've been covering for so many years are now here. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think the nature of war or conflict photography changed during the years that you were doing it? And then related to that, if there were young photojournalists asking you for advice now who want to cover that kind of thing, would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed exponentially because journalists have become a target in a way that we never were. You know, from the days in Iraq, I mean, at that point it started to get dangerous, but in Afghanistan and in the early days we used to drive around with big TV signs on our cars. You know, you can never do, now you'd be dead in about a second. So I think, there's no protection anymore that comes with being a journalist, and I think that it makes it a lot harder to cover a lot of the stories that we've covered. So what do I tell a young journalist? I tell them to think about the stories they want to tell, think about what they're interested in, and start telling those stories, get experience with, edgy situations before they throw themselves into Syria or any of those places. You have to be able to sort of challenge yourself and figure out your what you feel comfortable with. But you don't have to go to the Middle East to cut your teeth. There are places that you can go.
Hi, Lynsey. Thank
Hi.
you so much for this.
Sure.
I have 2 questions. You talked about Merck for Mothers and how that was a direct response to you covering maternal mortality. What other ways has your work impacted change that you're really proud of?
I have no idea. I mean, people ask that, like, do you have that definitive photo? I don't think so. I mean, I hope that the work has made an impact over time. I know I get a lot of emails from people who have said that it's impacted them, but I can't say that there's been a direct sort of effect on policy or something. The Merck for Mothers thing, I only know because Dr. Naveen Rao, the guy who sort of showed that work, he basically started showing all the board members of Merck the Time magazine piece and the video I did. He started showing them sort of quietly, and then they made this decision to start Merck for Mothers. I only know that because I spoke at the UN General Assembly this year, and he was there, and he told me that. And I didn't really know that had happened. So often I don't hear about what happens. I just take the pictures and kind of send them and move on.
Could you tell us a little bit about the psychological space that you inhabited before and after?
You mean, do I have PTSD? How do I cope with? I'm a very open person. I talk about things very openly, and I think that helps me process things. I think I also come from a really loving, supportive family, which is big, so I feel very like I have a great support network. But I don't, that's not to say I don't have issues. I'm sure that I do. I think I don't know, when I feel, I go with my instinct a lot. So if I feel I need to step back from the front line, I do. I don't feel like I need to prove anything. And sometimes I just don't go to war for like a year or two. I don't feel like I need to cover those stories. I cover certain stories based on what speaks to me at that time. But psychologically, I don't know. I mean, I'm generally a pretty happy person, but certainly there are things that trigger a lot of emotion for me, and often it's in response to something that I've been through, or I'm doing my first photo book right now, and I've been interviewing some of the people in my photos, and that's been really tough because, one of the guys I was with in the Korangal, I mean, that's, it brings up a lot. But I think I'm open to that. I'm open to feeling that because I think it's important.
I would like to know a few things. First, sort of like continuing with what Shalini just asked, how do you manage not only to cope with the things that you've seen, and we've briefly talked about it, but how do you now have a child yourself? Mm-hmm. How do you project yourself in your family life, and how do you balance that? Most of the people in this room are not freelancers. You are. How do you balance those worlds of not being rushing towards the next assignment because you never know when the phone's going to ring or not?
Yeah.
Yet have a life.
God, it's a lot of questions. Okay, you might have to remind me because I'm getting older. First of all, I'll work backwards. I've never had a job. Like I've my whole career I've been freelance. So I've always hustled a lot, and I've always sort of been, at any given time, I'm always sort of researching the next story and making pitches and trying to figure out what story would work for what publication. And so that's a very big part of staying busy, is making sure I'm constantly on top of sort of, what the next story will be. So a lot of my time is still, I still spend a lot of my time doing that. I never really get complacent and assume that people will come to me with assignments. I think our industry has changed a lot. I think a lot of people don't have money. Freelancers were asked to shoot stories in 5 days rather than 3 weeks. So it's very hard to make a living. I have to make a living in other ways. I mean, income has been generated from the memoir I wrote, which I didn't expect at all because I didn't think anyone would read it. But it's hard, and it's hard. That said, it's hard to balance having a child. That's why I was really sort of terrified to have a child, and I waited till I was 38 because I just didn't know how I could balance it. I have a great husband who's very supportive and who's very hands-on, and he is at home. So, that's a very big help. But I can't just go on the road and stay out for 2 months anymore. I mean, I just can't do it unless, it's just too much to ask, I think, at this point. So I have to do things, I have to really balance and try and have a balance at home as well as away, So it's hard. I'm always struggling with that. And I don't think it'll get easier, really. What else?
I think that was pretty much it. Just a little follow-up. Do you think that change or that evolution in your life is having and will have an impact in the way you photograph and the way you...
Yeah, I mean, I've changed the way, but I'm not really covering news anymore, because I just don't, basically, it was very clear when I started to become unavailable at like a moment's notice. There were certain publications that just dropped me because I wasn't convenient anymore. And I think that's a product of being a parent, or, and that's sort of what happens. But I've then tried to use that to start focusing on longer stories where I have a little flexibility with when I go in and out. There's still stories that dictate, of course, the story still dictates when we need to be there as journalists. If something is going to happen, we have to go. We can't say, well, I can't get a sitter, or, So it's always stressful, but I think I've basically shifted to doing more long-term stories. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was wondering, after you've covered so many wars, at the end, do you finish liking wars or liking something about wars that you don't find in normal life? Or
I mean, I don't think anyone likes war. I mean, I think it's a matter of, there are incredible moments of beauty in war. Yeah, there are moments of, you see incredible generosity, you see resilience, you see, I see people never cease to amaze me with what they can handle and how they handle themselves under the worst of circumstances. And I think that's something to learn from. I think, I've learned from that, even in my own kidnapping in Libya. I remember the darkest moments where I was being punched in the face or groped and, had a gun to my head and told I was going to be executed that night. I just thought, well, the women in Congo have been able to deal with this, and they've been raped over and over, and if they can do it, I can do it. And so, I've tried to use that mentality to help myself get through really tough times, and it's worked, So if that's a good moment, then to me that's, yeah.
Is there an adrenaline rush that war
of course
journalists get addicted to?
I mean, look, of course there's adrenaline in a war zone. I mean, that's sort of what keeps you through the sleepless nights and to walk 7 hours with everything on your back. And, I think, of course there's adrenaline, but I think everyone covers war for different reasons. For me, it was never the adrenaline that kept going back. It was the fact that, witnessing history, witnessing policy, trying to affect policy, trying to be there to see what was actually going on. Those were all things that were very important to me. And the lifestyle is, of course, it's like in a war zone, everything, you're experiencing the extremes of everything. And so that, of course, can be addictive. But I think it's important to be aware of that and to ask yourself, like I ask myself every story, why am I going? What am I contributing to this coverage? Do I have to be there? Am I just going because it's a knee-jerk reaction that I know how to cover war and I know I'll get dramatic pictures? Because war does produce dramatic pictures. But it's much harder for me to cover a story like following 3 pregnant women because it's not so dramatic, But it's important, I think it's also important to tell those stories. So.
Why did you start to write a memoir, and what was the most difficult part of it?
I started to write a memoir because I got out of Libya and I got approached by like 3 or 4 different literary agents saying you should write a book, you're a woman, you've been through this, and there aren't that many women. And I thought, no, I'm not going to write a book just because I was kidnapped. That's crazy. And, I'm not that interesting. And so I said, no. And then Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros were killed. And I had sort of a meltdown. I had survivor's guilt. Why did they die and we didn't get killed? And so I went through a really tough month or few months. And at that point, I was approached by Amanda Urban, who is a very big literary agent here in the U.S., and she said, can we meet? And I said, I'm not really interested in writing a book, but she's like such a legend that my writer friends were like, oh my God, if she wants to meet you, you have to meet her. So I went in and she was amazing. I mean, she was smart, she was funny, she knew everything about me, she knew I loved James Salter, she knew all these things that no one really knew. And she just convinced me that I had a voice and that I knew how to write and I should write a book. And I sort of was like, maybe it's a good time to step back. And then I got pregnant like that week, basically. And so then I was like, all right, well, I might as well write a book because at some point I'm going to have to stop shooting to deliver. And so then I said, okay. And so, yeah. And it was good. I loved it. I loved the process of writing because I loved being able to sort of download everything I had been through for so many years that I had never really processed. So it was great. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I wanted to ask, I remember when the excerpt of your book came out in the magazine and the huge reaction that it got at the time. Mm. And I wanted to ask you sort of how you processed. There was a lot of criticism about your choices, the fact that you're pregnant and going, and I wondered if you could sort of talk through sort of how you dealt with that reaction and how for you yourself, in terms of being able to explain yourself? Did you feel like it was unfair that you were being held to this other sort of, double standard?
No, I think that's what people do. I think people love to project their own issues onto other people, and I actually didn't have any problem with it because, I'm very lucky in that I was raised in a very unconventional family. My father came out when I was 8. I was taught from a very young age to just respect people for who they are, to not be judgmental, to, let people be themselves. And so that is something that has been really, really impressed on me from a very young age. And so I feel really confident with the decisions I make. I think that was a decision I made with my husband. There were other journalists that I turned to. There were no photographers that I knew at that point who had been pregnant. But there were other journalists that I sort of looked to, and I immediately understood so much when I became pregnant, and I was terrified about, how would I continue working? How will I have my life? Where will this fit into my life? And I think it was important to be honest about that, because I find that very few women especially are honest about those things, their ambivalence with being pregnant, because they're so terrified of being judged. And I didn't mind publicly sort of being skewered, because I'm happy. At the same time, I was receiving dozens of emails from women around the world saying, thank you for being honest, thank you for taking a risk, thank you for working while pregnant, thank you for getting out there, thank you for, fighting back and saying, what about all the pregnant women in the US who work at chemical factories and expose their unborn babies to chemicals? What about all the women in Somalia who were pregnant? So, for me, I didn't mind being that person that people could vent if it brought the discussion to the table, because I don't care. I mean, people can judge me all they want, but ultimately it's a decision that I make with my husband, and yeah.
Hey there, Lynsey.
Hi.
Did you keep a journal, or did you take personal notes that you drew on to write the memoir at the time?
Yeah. So I wrote. And some of those actual handwritten letters will go into the photo book. So from the time I was 20, I wrote very faithfully to my old college roommate from everywhere around the world, kind of handwritten letters. And then I used those for about a 10-year period of time. And then I used emails. I went back to entire takes of stories, so not just the edits, but I looked at every single picture I took. And I interviewed people in my life. So I tried to, I interviewed my father, my mother, my friends, people I was with in certain situations, and made sure. And then I hired a fact checker also to sort of fact check my life and my memoir to make sure that it was right. Yeah.
And how did it match up?
It matched up. I mean, it matched up. There were certain situations where I had to kind of go to like a third or fourth person, because, I think people's memory is subjective. And so I think, but overall, there were certain things I sent everyone their sort of chapters. So, my family, I sent my family in a first draft, sort of how I wrote about it. And there were certain parts that my father had a hard time with, so I kind of wrote differently. I respected, I wanted to make sure he was okay with what I wrote, so I rewrote some things. One of my colleagues in the book had issues with how she was portrayed, so I kind of rewrote. I tried to be respectful, but I also had to, own up to my own experiences, that these are my experiences, and I'm entitled to them. Yeah.
Share the details of who will be playing you in the major motion?
Oh, not really, do I? Jennifer Lawrence.
If you haven't read the book, I really do highly recommend it. And I was thinking, I read some young photographer commenting that, he was hoping to be a photographer, and this book had given him so much inspiration. And I thought how great for young photographers to have this document, but it really is I was just thinking about my daughter and her generation and her friends, and it's inspirational to anybody sort of thinking about a path forward and not wanting to do it in necessarily conventional ways. So congratulations on that, and thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank all of you for being here to listen to Lynsey's story. Good night.